So we're going to run, this session is like 45 minutes. So hopefully English is good for a lot of us here. If you still have any question about what we're going to discuss today, or if you have anything you want to mention about the use case or what you study, or even what you work on, so we have our booth on the corner here, so feel free to stop by as well. I want to make it like easy session today. I want to explain this topic to you so in a way where you understand what stream processing is and where you can use it also even in your work. So the goal is not to be expert in stream processing today. The point is to get started. Obviously, because there are a couple of keywords on the screen here, so we'll go through these keywords. So discuss what real-time is, what do we mean by that, stream processing, and obviously how much time you can spend in this process, how much time for development, how much time it takes you to put it into production, and essentially also even how you can test it. So my name is FAWAZ GHALIREAL-TIME. I'm based in the UK, in London, and today I kind of like nothing new to this community, so this is I think for time. We had one with the Java Turkish community before, and that was in Ankara, in Istanbul. So I really like this community here, and I want to make sure that you're also happy. So feel free to tag me Twitter, LinkedIn, or if you want just to come by and say hello, and even like if you want to discuss your own career. HAZELCAST is a remote company, started here in Turkey, in Istanbul. We have office in Turkey, so if you're also interested in working for HAZELCAST, or you want to know about the procedure, so feel free to talk to me about it. So just to get going, this topic is important in terms of how we want to approach it. So the idea is to focus on the screen, right? So anyone recognize these guys on the screen?
Yeah. You think that?
Okay.
We go for it? Oh, for sure.
Yes. These are greeters, right? So when I mention stream processing, streaming, people assume we're talking about music or TV shows, maybe Spotify or what is equivalent here in Turkey, or Netflix and so on. And essentially this is part of the story. So whenever you hear stream processing or data streaming, what we kind of like look for is description of real-time stream processing. So part of the story is music streaming, but obviously you see it everywhere. So you see it in your bank, for example, if you have a smart device, you see it in machine learning, even if you want to kind of like look at it at financial institutions. And all these aspects come into place when it comes to real-time stream processing. So to give you an idea why this is important, why you should care about stream processing, we have to look at numbers, right? We need to see how much this industry costs for businesses. So all companies you heard of or you deal with, whether you are an end user, for example, or you have a mobile app for these companies, they use some type of stream processing. For example, if we talk about banks, if you have a debit or credit card, for example, and you try to do a transaction, banks need to check if it is you who is using your card, or if it is someone else who is using this card. So this is very important. It's very important to actually see how big this industry is. So we're talking about 30 billion USD dollars per year. So we want to look at it for 10 years, it's 10 times more, or even a little bit extra. So this is very serious topic, and this is not, you can go home and develop this solution. You need to make sure you use the right tool. So most people assume basically you kind of like have a use case or a problem and try to solve it, right? So who is currently working? Okay, that's good. and the rest, I would assume, are students or you have some kind of experience with Java and development. And so the message when you have a use case or a problem is you have some kind of, a code, or you want to have it to write a program and then you want solution. But that's not the case, right? We all know, or most of us know, this is far by until if you want to put it into production. So if you have a Java application, for example, or Python application, or machine learning model, it is really hard to put it into production for end users. So there are a couple of elements you want to focus on. So whether, even if you have perfect code, people spend so much time on figuring out the best solution for the problem, but that's not how you're supposed to approach it. This is actually, it's the wrong way. Because when it comes to put it in production, there are so many elements comes into place. So for example, how you can deploy it. So if I ask you now to go and write a Java application, and even this Java application works as you expect, how do you take it and put it into production? So this is what it matters. So I think if you work with machine learning, I spent 10 years working in machine learning, actually only to find out that whatever machine learning models you develop, there is no guarantee it can run in real time in production. Obviously, also you want to monitor your application. So whether you use a big cluster of 5 nodes, or you use 2 clusters of 10 nodes, what is the difference between these two? And how can you make sure you can scale your application? So to discuss real time and what it means, anyone can guess how long it takes for an eye to blink? So like we all now are blinking for 2 seconds. 40 milliseconds. Okay?
Half a second.
Half a second. So yeah, so I would say it's getting between, so on average it's roughly of around 1/3 of a second, so 350 milliseconds. In some use cases it is 500 or half second, some use cases is 50. It depends on age, sex, and so many factors. So this is pretty fast, right? So for an eye to blink and you want to write an application to measure it, you might get away with it. You might be able, by asking now, find a Java force or whatever to measure eye blinking in this row. You probably can get away with it, and you can put it into test and it works. But now if I ask you to go out and try it, probably it will crash. Same thing for back of hands, or if you have it, some kind of digital SLR. So these actions are really fast. There's no guarantee if you want to scale this for 1 million or 10 million or 100 million to be able to manage it to run it into production. Of course, you see it everywhere. So with banks, for smart devices, IoT devices, smart cars, hospitals, they start to implement it, and footballs, for example, VR, they use real-time scene processing and machine learning. Now, if we look at this example here, just to understand what's going on, so hopefully just you can follow along this example. So we're going to take a count for detection as example here. So imagine you have a credit card or debit card, you're trying to take some money out of your bank account. So you actually swipe your card, put your PIN number, and this request goes to your bank validates that it is you, and then they send the agreement or acceptance, and they get the money out of your bank account. So there are so many steps in it. So for the first step is basically to ingest the data or read the data, and then you want to enrich it, add more into it, and then you have to do some kind of data transformation in order to make sure that you use the right features. And obviously when it comes to making sure that it can run and you do the prediction, it is you using the card or not. So can anyone guess how long it takes for this operation to be complete? What's the SMA or time frame?
1 second.
5 seconds.
So each one. Keep on.
80 seconds.
He found it.
600 milliseconds. So yes, we're talking about sub-seconds here for this action. So this is work for, depends on the bank, obviously, if they're using open banks or not. So it takes around, depends on the bank, it takes around 50 to 200, in some use cases it's close to 500. But this is less than 1 second, so it's sub-seconds we're talking about. And if you look at the data here, so I know the font size is small, so come speak to me afterwards if you want to get this code. So essentially, data is connected to your card. So this is first step. And then you add more to it, kind of the user account, for example, where he or she is located, how much money they have in their bank, and so on. And then you do something called feature engineering, which is a process to decide which attribute to use for this process. And obviously, when it comes to real-time machine learning or stream processing defense, you look at the models, and then this is where the bank sends yes or no for this card. So it took me 4 or 5 minutes to explain this procedure here. And the idea is basically to use 2 different types of data. So I would say 99% of people in this room use historical data. We use batch data. So whether it's in file system or in database, the way we work, we read this data, we store it into database, and then we load it back into memory, we do the process, and then we do visualization. So this is not what we're discussing today here. This is actually called batch data, and it's fine for some applications, but most applications these days are moving towards real-time. Real-time means, for this type of application, you want to process the data as soon as you get it, before you store it into database. So let me say it again, because this is very important to understand. You want to process the data, you want to do data analysis, you want to do machine learning on the data as it arrives before you store it into the database. And this is not easy. It's not easy because you want to make sure you don't lose data, for example. You want to make sure that you can scale it. And obviously, you want to make sure you can combine it with the historical data and batch data. Now, to look at these in real life use case, the fraud detection, so some features related to age, for example, how old you are, related to gender, female, male, and so on, and related to how much or how many transactions you had before. So this is called batch features, so it's static features. Obviously, your age doesn't change between day or 2 or whatever, because this is where, or even gender, for example, or even average daily spends and so on. Some features change dramatically, dynamically in real time in terms of how much money you're trying to take out of your bank account, how far from your home. So for example, if I'm in Turkey now, in Istanbul, someone is using my card back home in Liverpool, we want to make sure that we know the distance, GPS coordinates, in order to detect its fraud or not. And there are some features which are in between. Let's just forget about this for a second. So we want to use all these features, and obviously we want to be able to do some kind of alerts. So the idea here is to take 1 million transaction or 10 million transaction and provide some kind of alerts, or even some kinds of data enrichment, so where you do a contextual enrichment or even defining traits. So you want to make sure to find this needed. You don't care about whole transactions, you care only about small percentage of these transactions. Now, in order to apply these solutions, usually you need 2 tools or more. So one tool should be for stream processing, with how many of you here or use Kafka? Cool. So Kafka is good for data streaming. If you want to do stream processing, you need the other part of storage, which is the fast data storage. Something like maybe Redis, for example, or MongoDB. These tools you need basically to use into packages. Now I work for a company called HAZELCAST, as I mentioned. So the HAZELCAST is a real-time stream processing platform. You use it essentially to write these type of applications. So it's open source, which means you should be able to download the jar file or program language you use, and you should be able to do the same solution. On one side, you get to see your data source or mode. So whether you deal with Kafka or message queue or IoT device or enterprise applications. And once you ingest the data into your platform, into your application, you can proceed to do some kind of stream processing. Or even when you load it from batch or from physical or from database and so on. And then you can combine between the two in order to do the stream processing. Obviously, you need to stay on top, so those who are data scientists in this role or work with machine learning don't want to learn to program language. What you can do is use SQL. So I will show you today how you can achieve it in SQL. So this is good if you want to use the SQL for this type of applications. And of course, I want to make it easy, right? So for you, whatever you decide to use it, just come speak to me. I will get you going here. And once you have the data, you can basically output it some kind of thing. Obviously, in most cases, if you have application which has a web interface or web socket, and I come back next day, I ask you, I want you to change your output to some different platform, you need days or weeks to do this change. Whereas with HAZELCAST, it's just a matter of 2 or 3 lines of code. So I want to make it easy to implement these solutions, and obviously, this is where things break. So essentially, it is the scaling, that's what is important here, right? So when I mention scaling, for some of you, scaling means you scale your data, so you add more data to your application. For some of you who work with DevOps and so on, scaling means hardware or processing. And the right answer is not either of these, it's combination. So what you want is to make sure you scale up or down based on how much data and where is your data center. So for example, if I have data center here in Istanbul and a data center in the UK, at the same time, I want to make sure my process or API or microservice related to Istanbul is located in Istanbul. And same thing for the one is the UK. The idea is to make sure latency is as small or as minimum as possible. So this is where we start to gain benefits of this type of solutions. Now, we talked about Kafka, so let's see how we can implement these solutions. So from Kafka, you have Kafka topic. So this is the transactions coming in Kafka topic. You want to connect it into your application. So I'm going to use Python for the machine learning part and use Java for deploying it. If you want to have discussion which is better, Python or Java, and some of you I know prefer Java, some of you prefer Python, come speak to me also afterwards. I explain, but in simple terms, you want to use Python for developing the model, creating a machine learning model, and you need to use Java for deployment. So this is the best outcome you can get. Of course, you can discuss as I mentioned. So this is where you plug in your models and you make sure you connect it to the Python virtual machine, and at the same time you connect you to the actual code for Java or to run this platform. And once you're happy with the results, you can send it to a sync, which means you can output it maybe to a different Kafka copy. Now, microservices. Who knows microservices here? Good. So usually applications for stream processing, it's not monolithic application. It's not a standalone applications. So you don't end up with like one standard line of code and you say, hey, I want to do stream processing with this large application. What you can do is kind of like use a microservice architecture, and the microservice architecture allows you to split your application into smaller parts, and from there you should be able to connect multiple parts. So this is called DAC architecture, and the benefits here is you connect different microservices to different Kafka topics, and this will allow you to read from one topic out to second one, and process it in parallel. So this is very important to do it, because it means you should be able to handle multiple requests at the same time. Now, I mentioned the Python development for machine learning model. That's essentially, once you have the Python virtual machine up and running, you just need to make sure to connect it to Java virtual machine. You don't need to care about this part. So this one part will be handled by HAZELCAST. I just need to make sure that you understand you can connect multiple programming languages into your architecture here. Now, most of us are on this upper side of this screen, so we have one input, one score, and then one output. But what we want is to move to something called composite score, so which means I should be able to provide multiple solutions at the same time for the same problem. So again, this is very important to understand. We need to provide multiple solutions or multiple machine learning models or multiple Java applications with different outputs in order to get this composite score. So let's just look at this example. My demo today, I'm going to demonstrate how you can use it for fault detection. So if I continue, okay, I use my card, as I try to use my card again in Germany, for example. If there is a time frame for 2 hours, I should be able to get the results, because that's how long it takes for a plane to fly between two cities. If I repeat it again between London and New York, my batch should decline it, and this should be considered as fraud, because there is no way to fly between London and New York in 2 hours. Now, someone asked me this question before, so why this is important? Anyone can write these applications, right? So I had to look up for the answer. Especially we have roughly about 250 flights per week, and then you have to take this number, multiply by number of passengers, and then number of passengers by number of cars, in order to get this algorithm at scale. So we're talking about numbers. So some of us here have 1,000 or 2,000 transactions or 2,000 records in our table. We're talking about 1 billion transactions per second. So that's how big these applications are. And this is in just 45 nodes and with under 30 milliseconds. So it's pretty fast, it's pretty quick. And we also want to know how we can develop it. So the code is on the screen. Let me jump quickly to line ID and show you what you need to do to run this application. So I asked our staff, so I have workshop, so don't worry about what we see now. It's good if you can just get going, but I have workshop after lunch, I don't know, maybe 1 cup or so. So if you want to try it out and to have laptop come after this workshop, I should be able to explain what we need to do. But for the rest of us here, I'm going to explain what I mean and what you need to do in order to run these applications. So first of all, I have app currently on my laptop. It doesn't matter if you use laptop or cloud or this type. I'm running it locally. So I got Kafka server and basically the Zoom debug. So this is kind of like we need it for run Kafka. And then in my code, again, if you want this code, speak to me afterwards. So what I did here, hopefully you can see it on screen, so I tried to increase the size. So I have my Java application, I'm using Java. Obviously, if you work with Java, you use POM file or guided prints. I'm using POM. So in your case, you already have Java application, so keep it as it is, don't change it. What you need just to change libraries. So in my case, I'm using HAZELCAST. So I say I want to import HAZELCAST to my application. You can do the same for your application. And from here, let's just generate some data. So what you see here, hopefully it worked. So I'm going to increase the size. So this is dynamic now running in real time. So I'm just measuring events. So I'm generating transactions, and I want to process these transactions. So you can see on screen, if you can, so 105, 6, 7, 8, 12, 19, and so on. So these are transactions. It's very important to understand these transactions are not coming from database, are coming in this very moment. And in my application, which I'm going to show you because I use something called Lambda function in Java. As you know, you will start with Lambda before it. So for the rest, Lambda essentially allows you to run multiple commands in simple tags at the same time, so you don't need to write it in order. So you can say this is 1 to 5 transactions I want to implement. So I'm gonna use Lambda function. In my case, I'm reading the data from Kafka. With real-time data, we don't know the end. Now, if I ask you how many records in your database, you know the answer, right? So you can do SQL query, select star count, or you can just look at it and you can come up with real-time data. You don't. You know, maybe you know the start where the data is started, but we don't know where the end of this data. So what you can do is say, I'm getting this data, and then I need to apply window. So window, for example, 10 or 15 or 50, depends. So you say, I want to apply window, and then I can close it. Obviously, you need to shift this window, so which means you move it a step by step, or 10 step by step, 10 step, and so on. And if we run the main application now, so the main application starts HAZELCAST instance, as you see here. So this is HAZELCAST running. I'm using one cluster, one node. And if we scroll down, the events, so this is kind of like the aggregation function for now. So the aggregation function tells me how many transactions per second on this one cluster, one node. So I'm gonna read it out if you don't see it on the screen. So 4, 3, 7, 6, 4, 3, 2, 8, 11, 6, 3, and so on. So you get the idea how many transactions per second for this type of application. So in this process, what we did is we aggregate many events or transactions, and then we should be able to process it. But this is not really stream processing, isn't it? Because this is kind of like, gives you some idea, but it doesn't tell you where the fraud is, which what we're trying to do. Of course not. So every time you hear of Kafka application or data streaming applications, they're capable of doing what you see on the screen here. What we want is to take it a step further. So I really want you to try it out after we finish, because I want you to have some experience with stream processing. If you have this experience with the stream processing, you're not only gain some knowledge, but also you increase your chances in getting a really good job. So this is very important. So let's just now leave it running and see how the stream processing enrichment comes into place. So remember what I mentioned. So currently the process is I have Kafka running, and then I have Java application, and now I want to do the stream processing in order to do data enrichment. So in my case, because I came from data science background, yes, I have Java experience, I have Python experience, so I prefer Python. I try to use Python because it's easier to even communicate. You don't even need to know English or Turkish language in order to know SQL. SQL is kind of like a similar language, and it's easy to communicate ideas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create map in memory in order to process this data. So I already ran this query here, and I'm going to show you on screen. So this is Kafka running. Forget about it for now. I'm going to increase font size, don't worry. So on this left side here, the left side of the screen, this is HAZELCAST running locally. So I'm running it in embedded mode. And on the right side, which I'm going to increase the size now, I have the events running. So for example, if I say, let's just keep it simple for now. I want to click on orders for this moment. Here. So what you see on the screen is, I know it's quick, I know it's small, but let's just see. So these are actually transactions happening at this time. Each transaction has amount, how much, and then how many elements or how many items with this order. And it's running in real time. So the data you see on screen is not coming from database, it's coming from the screen. And I'm not gonna stop it as a process. So if I stop now here, and I run it back again, it's a new data, right? So let's just have a look at it. So this is different from what you already saw. And of course, you can do this one. So say for example, I want to know all transactions for a specific user. So in this case, I'm gonna use myself, right? So I can say, for example, give me all orders for this user here. So we can, in this case, or for this, increase the size. So I'm going to copy this. You can do it in Java, you can do it in Python, but let's just keep it now in Python, also in SQL. So let's just press this command here.
You know what is what made. And a question or
Okay, so now I'm just filtering out some results here. So the difference now you see, all the difference you see on the screen are just my transactions, right? So now what I want to do is be able to detect which of these transactions are fraud. So my bank declined it, doesn't allow it, and so on. So I'm gonna stop it again, but it is just stopped on the screen. It's still running in memory. So let's just make sure that it is running. So again, it's just my transactions here. So quickly, let's just stop it and do the data enrichment. So banks usually use something called credit score. Does it exist here? Yeah. You have credit score. So credit score is essentially a number attached to your account. We don't need to know how banks calculate it, but usually if you have house, for example, if you have mortgage, if you apply for a loan, how old are you, do you have job, and so on. So many factors, but essentially they end up with a number. In my case, I'm not going to use the credit score for this type of this. I'm going to be generous. So I'm going to use 3 different features, and then these 3 features are red, blue, green. It's not what banks use in real time, but it's just like I want to flag direct activities. So I'm going to create a new map now in memory. So again, this is SQL code, but obviously you can use Java. So this now is in memory. So currently I have 2 maps in memory. One map is transaction, and the other map are features which can detect my credit score or if there is a fraud in my account or not. Now let's add some data into it. So in my case, this is me, first one. Obviously I'm having just random users here. So I want to know which of these transactions are fraud. So again, let's just take it from here and put it into memory. So I'm adding data into map now. This data is static and considered batch data. So if I do query on this map, second map, of course I have limited number of entries in it. Now, this is what the stream processing is essentially. We're going to combine data from 2 sources. So the real-time source, transactions, and the batch data from second map where we have some kind of fraud detection features. So if I run it now, so before I run this query, I'm gonna show you the previous one. So the previous one, just a quick reading to show you the previous process. So it's very important because now I have two streams in memory, and these two streams, one does transactions, no credit card features or no false features connected. So let us quickly, I just want to make sure. Okay, maybe I'll copy it first and then. Well, this is the previous query we are on. That's why again to make sure it is working. Again, this is just the data streaming part, and now what we want to do is enrich it obviously with the streaming data. Now here we do the second one. So the second one essentially what is saying, I want to do join statement in SQL. So join statement in SQL allows you to join two queries. You can do it in Java, you can do it in programming language. Suddenly, I'm now flagging only red activities in my transactions, only the activities which we believe are fraud activities. So if I run now this query here, so you see the difference. Now we have two streams connected, and only red transactions you see it are flagged. Now obviously you need to do some kind of processing how you want, so whether you decline the card or do some kind of others, whatever. So data now is flagged, and this is data flagged into memory, which allows you to actually decide which activity is a fraud. So we're looking at second campaign. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. I know it's too much, and we want to take it step by step. So if you're interested with this part of data and this type of applications, feel free to join the workshop after lunch. You and I will go through it. But before you move, I just want to go back quickly to my slides. And just to give you the overview of this type of applications. So exactly what I demonstrated is what you see here. So the first step is the base data from Kafka, and once this data loads into memory, I can do data enrichment where the stream processing comes into place, and then I get this combination between the two in order to get results out. So it's pretty good if you want to try it, give it a try and see how it works. Obviously, like I mentioned, we have both over there. There is a Nintendo Switch giveaway, so make sure to scan your code and join us tomorrow on 4:15 or 6:15. This is our community Slack. If you have any question, take a screenshot of this or just scan it and join the community. As I mentioned, we have large community here in Turkey and in Istanbul. It will be really nice for you to join this community. You can ask questions, you can learn about stream processing if you're interested in hiring, job hunting, and if you like this area, come speak to me. I can get you also very with this. So with that being said, thanks very much for attending, and hopefully it was great. So we're going to take a few questions.
Please.
If you want, you can ask from Imam.
And if you want asking in Turkish, we can do translation, right?
Yes. I send you with translation.
So feel free to ask about the topic or anything related to development or machine learning if you want.
Aslında benim sorular mesela o kapı kullanıyorlar ya. Yine söylememi emkül kullanmıyor öyle. Peki. The question is in your slide that we saw that you are using a Kafka. Why you are not in Rapid?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, it depends where the Kafka is popular, so it depends on how many companies are still recording or not.
Ediyor musunuz?
So just to make sure that I don't mention companies, but if you want, we can speak about companies outside. So, I mean, Kafka is popular, so which means so many companies are using Kafka. This you can use in Tier 40 example, or you can use combination between the two. So there is nothing wrong in between Kafka and RabbitMQ. If you usually large applications like this one kind of requires large state, which means you end up having multiple sources. I can't name companies because it's being recorded now. So, but if you want, this is outside. I can give you some names. Companies, for example, you have these companies on your mobile. They use specific technology, obviously, with sometimes, so it becomes easier when you want to discuss it. Kafka is open source again. Of course, with RabbitMQ, we have to fork it on and so on. But this will give you some clear answer. I'll give you something about that.
Yes. You said that it's open source, but is it free to use for its specs?
So that's a good question. So the question is, we have open source and we have enterprise. So open source is exactly what I'm described here today. So you should be able to connect it and run or detection with open source. And again, I can't name companies but I know companies who use HAZELCAST as open source. Now, for an enterprise, it's not free, but it's an enterprise, and companies need to pay us and so on. So we have enterprise version, which actually has some features that don't exist in the open source. Now, these features related to one application. So if you have multiple data centers, this is the one feature that makes sure to duplicate data. Security, because if you work with fraud, you need security on top of it. Tiered storage. Remember what I mentioned about the data running in memory. So if I lose power for whatever reason, you want to make sure that you don't lose data, so you want to make sure to lock it into this, but without affecting data. So this is enterprise feature. So there are some features for enterprise. In some cases, open source is the way to go, but then at some point, obviously, it depends on big your application, what we want in production, so you need to shift to enterprise. But for majority of us here today, for the workshop, everything is open source, so you should be able to get powered without need for an enterprise station.
You spend sir?
Nice to see.
If I want to join the workshop, is what the kind of software do I need on my MacBook?
So I've sent this slide. I can share it on screen now. So just take a screenshot of this one. So this is the training. I just want you to download Kafka because it will take maybe 5-10 minutes to download Kafka. HAZELCAST, you can plug it in 2 minutes. This is only if you want to do the workshop. So if you have this, and then we can go through the code and so on. So I don't want to discuss the workshop, but if you want to join, you need HAZELCAST and you need Kafka. Kafka will take some time to download, maybe 200 and 300 or 300 megabytes. So to take some time to download to on-board laptop. If you want to join, you don't have laptop, maybe, introduce yourself to someone who has laptop, and we can definitely work something out.
If there are not any questions about this slide, I'd like to ask that if you can talk about your academic history and give advice to university students.
True. So the question is about career. So this is very important. Every time I go to community event, I make sure that you get as help to hurry. So HAZELCAST technology is really cool. I work for HAZELCAST because I believe in HAZELCAST, I believe in technology, but this is just one part of the story. When it comes to career, if you are already established, you want to move, or if you are a student, you want to move into your career, you need to look at trends. This is very important. Trends usually means programming languages, obviously, platforms, tools, now most recently machine learning and generative AI and so on. So I did study computer science, so I assume most of you computer science of some sort. So I did study for computer science. I focused mainly on data science. Once I finished, I went to market. I have some experience programming. Of course, I have few years. At some point, if you want to make progress, you need to shift. So I was just discussing with students about this. You can't expect to make progress and evolve in your career path if you stay with the same technology or say that on server knowledge. So I moved to IT consultancy where, provide up. It's just after solution architects. So there is a programmer, and then there is solution architects, and then you can move to some kind of managerial role, for example, product management and so on, or consultancy. But then I decided to do a PhD, so this is where I came back because I kind of like data science and machine learning. I spent 10 to 15 years working in machine learning after my PhD, focusing on developing machine learning models and making sure we runs on large scales, mission critical applications. And then I came to the stream processing because this area now is very important. So we are in 2023 now. So last 20 years were batch applications, and now start movement to some kind of stream processing. So any company you name now on your mobile, they use some type of stream processing. Now, obviously, you need to get this experience, and this is the best way to do it with open source projects. It doesn't have to be HAZELCAST, it could be any open source project. We have office here in Turkey, so HAZELCAST started in Turkey. So, for example, if you like open source, you can contribute to open source projects on GitHub, and this will give you some experience, and then you can apply for jobs for that companies. So this one way to approach it. Other ways is to attend boot camps. Do we have boot camps in Turkey?
Yeah.
So boot camps are really good, give you experience and get you going. And the third part is to know someone who knows someone. I believe in this. I've never got a job where I didn't know someone from that company. So I've been to so many companies, and it's always a recommendation. So which means you need someone from that company to recommend you. Yes, you can apply directly, obviously, whatever, or find out companies. Now, I ask about the audience, so I know where you are in your career path. But if you don't plan basically to travel, you can still apply for remote jobs, which means you can apply for jobs in the UK or the US while you're still here. So this is another way to approach it. I can give you some tips, but off camera for that one as well. So there are a couple of options, but for you now, get some experience. If you can get some interns, HAZELCAST has some interns, so it doesn't mean you work for HAZELCAST, it means you have, final year project, for example, you can do with HAZELCAST. I know 3 or 4 interns, which means they are students, but they are final year and so on. So come speak to me, I can get you going in HAZELCAST interns if you're interested. So a couple of options, it depends, but always do it for the enjoyment, don't do it for money, trust me on this. You can get a really good job with good money, but you'll end up with a really bad situation because maybe amount of stress and so on. If you want this type of things, you have to like it, you have to enjoy it. Some people here work with 4 nines, which is 99.99. These applications here are 5 nines, which is 99.999 accuracy. It is the same thing having 1 year experience or 10 years experience in Java, the difference between 4 nines and 5 nines. So it should give you some ideas why this is important, why most of mobile apps you have now, they use same processing for this one. Okay. So thanks very much for attending. Hopefully you got something out of it. Stop by the booth or join the workshop or sneak to me. I'm online. I always reply, so give us follow, photo, whatever you want to do on social media. Or if you have a specific use case not related to stream processing, I would love also to talk about it if you want some feedback or other things. Thank you.